Hello, this is Adolfo, and in honor of MLK Day, I'm going to revisit a podcast on the Reverend Martin Luther King Jr. and his sermon during the Cold War against communism. And not as famous as his I Have a Dream speech for sure, but if you're unfamiliar with this one, stick around.
Brothers, I have a dream today.
Nearly 70 years ago, the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. preached a sermon against communism. It's not as well known as his I Have a Dream speech, of course. In the early 50s, in a summertime sermon, he said that communism and Christianity were incompatible. He gave several reasons. He said, in the first place, communism leaves out God and Christ. By the time King spoke these words, the communist effort to eradicate religion halfway around the world was well known. As The Guardian reported, within just weeks of the October Revolution, the People's Commissariat for Enlightenment, that's a Soviet agency, was established to remove all references to religion from school curriculums, atheism being the official state religion. In the years that followed this Russian Revolution, it was led by Bolshevik party leader Vladimir Lenin. In the years that followed this revolution, churches and monasteries, according to The Guardian, were destroyed or turned into public toilets. Now, Dr. King said communism regards religion psychologically as mere wishful thinking, intellectually as the product of fear and ignorance, and historically as serving the ends of exploiters. That's just a fancy way of saying stupid. Christianity is stupid, intellectually, psychologically, politically. But no matter how hard communism tried to wipe out religion, it failed time and time again. In times of religious persecution, Christianity goes underground. And so just like the early Christians sought escape from Roman persecution in the catacombs, Christians in communist countries hid their Bibles and met secretly to worship their king, the King of Kings. And Christians show up in the most unlikeliest of places too. For example, let me pull out this book. In Martin Gilbert's A History of the 20th Century, he notes the religious perspective of Joseph Stalin's daughter in her rebellion against one of history's worst dictators. Let me see if I can pronounce this Russian name. Svetlana Luluava was visiting India when she decided to defect. This was in 1967. The historian writes in volume 3, page 357, 5 days after reaching New York, Stalin's daughter gave a press conference highly critical of communism. She had come to the West, she said, to seek self-expression that has been denied me for so long in Russia. And she added, I was brought up in a family where there was never any talk about God. But when I became a grown-up person, I found it impossible to exist without God in one's heart. Joseph Stalin's daughter found it impossible to live without God as an adult. Now imagine that. From the belly of the atheistic beast that would seek to eradicate all religion from the face of the earth emerges a woman who stands up at great risk to her personal life and proclaims, "Give me God." It's like, I've seen what the devil looks like. Give me Jesus. And if you doubt that, just look up what happened to her family under Stalin. Dr. King said Christians believe in God. Communism does not. Therefore, a Christian cannot be a communist. Logical. Now, one of the reasons he even spoke about this topic was because in his day, communists really tried to persuade minority groups that they held the keys to true equality. King wasn't convinced Now, he never denied that American Christianity often fell short of its ideals, and he constantly pointed out the lack of a level playing field in economics, but he said, nevertheless, quote, Christianity at its best has never let go of the ideal that the end of all life is the glory of God. You could say King looked at human history as divine history. In other words, human beings were created by God's love. Human rights, therefore, are God-given rights, or as the Declaration of Independence said it, endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights. Not rights to be doled out by a communist government, or any government for that matter. Rights granted by the government today can be taken away by the government tomorrow. But God-given rights could never be taken away, no matter who was in office. Under communism, King said, the state can decide which rights, if any, you have and how long you can have them. As King said, quote, liberties of the press or pulpit expression, freedom to vote, one's freedom to listen to what news he likes or to choose his books and even his friendships are all restricted. Man has to be a servant, dutiful and submissive of the state, and the state is omnipotent and supreme, unquote. So in communism, then, the state gets the glory, when in fact, as King noted, the end of all life is the glory of God. King was certain of this. Failure to acknowledge the veracity of giving God the glory would lead to violence. Listen to his reasoning here. And I quote, since for the communists there is no divine government, no absolute moral order, there are no fixed, immutable principles, force, violence, murder, and lying are all justifiable means to the millennial end. Said Lenin, we must be ready to employ tricking, deceit, and lawbreaking, withholding and concealing truth. That the followers of Lenin have been willing to act upon his instructions is a matter of history, King said. And I gave some examples of that violence earlier. Now remember, King was a reverend. He said that while Christianity teaches that men and women are children of God, under communism, human beings, quote, become only a means to an end. And if any man's so-called rights or liberties stand in the way of that end, they are simply swept aside. King wasn't fighting for rights that he could later lose. This was no mere academic exercise for him. He was fighting for lasting change, the kind that comes with the right foundation, inalienable rights. Now, according to Stanford University, King's view in the early 1950s that communism and Christianity are fundamentally incompatible did not change later in his life. Stanford University notes that King began preaching on communism's challenge to Christianity in 1952, repeating sermons on the same theme throughout his career and including one as a chapter in his 1963 volume of sermons entitled Strength to Love. It's interesting, I found this quote on the Organization for World Peace. It says, nowadays people rarely know to what extent people suffered in the Soviet Union under communism. And while a mention of Nazism is enough to make one shiver in fear, communism has not accrued the same distaste nor been condemned by international figures to such a great degree. And they said this, statistics vary, but it's generally assumed that the Soviet death toll ranged from 15 to 60 million, far higher than figures relating to the Holocaust. And so Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels, who wouldn't have shed a tear if all religion was eradicated from the earth, set in motion ideas which led to death and more death in the hands of Vladimir Lenin and Joseph Stalin, men who sought their own glory, not God's, promised what they could not deliver, and in a cowardly pursuit of power, shut down free expression, critical thinking, debate, and self-determination. In other words, the communists, in their own countries kill life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness.
All these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal.
Thank you for listening. Please be sure to subscribe to be notified when the next podcast is out.